Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, and welcome back to another History Teacher Acts video. All right, as somebody that grew up in the United States and taught U.S. history, but now exclusively teaches world history, I love this topic that came across my feed. It's titled, How Each Major Nation Reacted to American Independence. And now that I teach university level world history, this is so cool because I love to see, the history that I grew up with and of course grew up teaching, but see it from a foreign perspective to get that big scope of about how American events affect, or at least were received, by the entire world. So this is from the channel Fire of Learning, and the video will be linked down below. Please watch that. In fact, watch that first, then come on back and see what I have to say, because I'm hoping to add any context that I can. With that, let's get started. I actually think one of the most important things that you can do as just a civilian person is to look at history, but not from the perspective of your own country and your own country's historians, but actually what other countries and people from other countries think. You may get a very interesting perspective, especially about its impact. So let's see what is going on here. I wonder what countries they're going to talk about and if they, felt it was important.
The United States of America declared independence from Great Britain on July 4th, 1776. In 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, its war for independence officially ended in victory. What were the world's reactions to this new country stepping foot onto the world stage?
So in you get the fighting in 1781, treaty in 1783. It brings the new border, okay, according to British perspective at least, of the United States to the Mississippi River. Okay, so that's how big the country was. Then you're going to get Louisiana Purchase a couple decades later, and then, Mexican-American War in the mid-1800s to expand.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. Let's find out. Starting with France, the French had welcomed the insurrection against Britain from the beginning and began secretly sending supplies to the Americans as early as 1776. Once it was clear that the rebels were able to endure a war and potentially even win, France openly established an alliance with America, which caused the British to declare war on them as well. The French then began to provide further support, such as weapons, ammunition, uniforms, etc., and sent forces to engage the British directly on land and sea alongside the Patriots, thanks in part to the diplomacy of men like Benjamin Franklin, who spent the war as a diplomat in France, advocating for the American cause. France, which was at the time under the rule of a monarch whose power was much more absolute than Britain's king, was not drawn to the American cause by anything like its revolutionary ideals. Rather, liberating the United States was simply seen as a strategically wise move. France was, at this time, in a fierce global competition with Britain. They had been defeated in North America in the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, a decade prior, which allowed Britain to claim many of their lands there, putting France at a disadvantage. American independence would check British power. As such, both the French government and people tended to be very supportive of the...
This picture. So I was letting it run a long time. I got plenty of things to add to this, but I just wanted to point that this Ben Franklin, like getting his bald head combed by French aristocracy. Dude, Franklin loved France, man. So Franklin was the most popular man in America in the colonial era. He also was tasked with trying to do diplomacy with the British. They sent him, he basically went to Parliament to explain the Americans' protest of taxes, and he had to go speak to an angry Parliament about why the Americans were being big angry babies. But he loved France. If you guys know, he was the partier, he was the ladies' man, and he loved that all the fun stuff I guess you could get going on in France. But you can learn a lot about his nightlife, by the way.
The endeavor. Briefly, they even considered invading Britain itself. While fighting in America raged, the French engaged the British elsewhere at the same time, such as the Caribbean and India. Furthermore, they would convince other powers to join the American side. French support was so crucial that argument could be made that without their assistance, Americans today could very well be speaking English instead of American.
Okay. Okay, so time to interject some things there. So I'm glad he brought up the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War, global war between Britain and France, basically for the planet. I mean, they fought each other on every continent. The crown prize of this whole conflict was India, far more than North America. But remember, the English won that war, and it completely ruined France. Actually, economically ruined Britain, at least temporarily, because they went into so much debt. That's a big reason why you see the British put in new taxes onto the American colonies to make up for that. And anyways, so the French were never really going to get much out of helping the Americans in this. It's sticking it to an old foe, right? Maybe try to knock them a little bit. France does not have the power to do a lot of direct combat really with them anymore. The 7 Years' War killed France, and it's indirectly going to lead to the financial problems on top of France's economic problems already existing. They're going to get the French Revolution. Okay, French Revolution's right around the corner here. It starts in 1789. So it's probably the country that reacted the most of all countries, really, from the American Revolution, because it's going to directly affect France. And French citizens were, may have applauded the Americans fighting back here, but day to day, French people don't care about that. What they're far more concerned is their country is spending money and lives fighting these foreign wars, right, with no democratic process, and it literally leading to the financial ruin of France. So yeah, you've got that going on here.
The Continental Congress did not have to worry about defending their online use from malware, phishing, password attacks, and other threats like these like we have to. But if they did, they would have sought the assistance of today's video partner, NordVPN.
Right.
By going to nordvpn.com.
All right, there's the link for that. Go support if you are interested in that. You want to see more from that. I want to make sure they get compensated for their ads. So go to the original video for that. So you can use their link. But anyway, so France had much bigger fish to fry in the years after this, and it's going to lead to their collapse. Back to the argument about France, if the French hadn't helped the Americans, what would have happened? It very well would not have gone the way it went. The French provided troops, but the biggest thing the French helped out with the French or with the American Revolution was naval power. The Americans did not have a navy, and in fact, to get the surrender of Cornwallis and the English military required the blockade that the British couldn't leave, and were basically forced to sign that surrender to end the war. So without that French assistance, it's a totally different scenario. Okay, are we going now speaking English rather than American? I don't know. People are already speaking their own thing there. But hey, if the French and Indian War and therefore the 7 Years' War had gone differently and the French had won that, could be speaking French right now over here.
The American rebels in an effort to check British power in 1776. In 1779, they declared war on the British. Although their battles primarily took place outside the 13 colonies, Spanish victories, such as the Siege of Pensacola
These were
and the
disastrous
successful
for France.
reconquest of West Florida in general, were still highly beneficial to the American side, as they distracted and weakened the British. After the war, the Spanish King Carlos III remained in personal correspondence with George Washington, and was even noted to have given him a gift of livestock. Still, as Stanley Payne discussed in his book, A History of Spain and Portugal, Spain had intervened more as an ally of France and enemy of Britain than as an ally of America. And
a lot of people forget it wasn't just the French that helped, but other countries. France by far the most, though.
Carlos did have his concerns about the new nation. Spain controlled a massive amount of land in the Americas, stretching from the south of South America all the way to the Louisiana Territory that bordered the new United States.
Pretty much half of the Western Hemisphere.
He feared that one day, the United States could pose a threat to Spanish holdings in the Americas. He also feared that the independence of one European colony in the Americas would set an unwelcome precedent for Spain's many colonies there. Both of these fears were realized in the following century. Portugal.
Yeah, that's when, starting right at the beginning of the 1800s, Spain starts losing control of those colonies. You're going to start to see Latin American wars of revolution and of independence, I should say, and break all that apart. And then it's not going to be the United States fighting, in North America to, part of Manifest Destiny to get all the way to the coast. It's going to be, by then, it was controlled by Mexico. It got their independence, Plus, you got to throw in the Napoleonic Wars right in the middle of that stuff, too. All right, what's the next country? So we have France, we've done Spain.
Was not active in the conflict. They had an age-old alliance in the following century. Portugal was not active in the conflict. They had an age-old alliance with Britain, but remained neutral throughout the war, as they had little reason to join, and were not even encouraged by Britain to join.
No.
Portugal
peaked, sadly, in the 1500s. That was their big peak. It's the first nation to really get involved into overseas colonization for in Europe, into places like Africa and Asia. You know, they had their glory days kind of in the 1500s, and as larger countries added or started joining the age of exploration, imperialism, like Spain, it really hurt them. It's really kind of the Dutch, you know, by the 1600s that really pushed down the Portuguese.
It would have likely sparked a conflict with Spain, with whom they had just fought an unsuccessful war from
Brazil's going to get their
1776 to 77. Britain reinforcing Portugal would have unnecessarily complicated the conflict for them, especially given that, as Payne also mentioned, the Portuguese navy had been neglected and their treasury empty. Okay. Russia and its Empress Catherine remained officially neutral. Though Russia was a colonial power in North America, the fact that it was not especially expansive there and approached it from the opposite side.
There's some interesting correspondence too between Russia and, you know, like when the United States becomes a country, and you know, like welcome to the club. Catherine's such a fascinating figure because she really followed in the wake of Peter the Great and really pushing Russia into the European community, I guess you would say, with their forced westernization of their country and trying to be kind of at that table. You know what I mean?
Meant it was not generally involved in the colonial conflicts of the Americas. However, they were more interested in the conflict than one might expect. There were a number of notable Russian elites in this time who expressed their approval and even admiration for the American Revolution. According to Nikolai N. Bolkovitinov in his paper The Declaration of Independence, A View from Russia, the Empress herself blamed the British for the upheaval and felt it might even be advantageous for Russia if British power were checked by the independence of their colonies.
So it's so funny because the irony of these monarchs, like, supporting the American Revolution, not for any Enlightenment principles, right? Which is what the Americans were supposed to be so big on, right? You know, freeing themselves from a monarchy and getting independence. While at the same time, Catherine was absolutely brutal to the workers and to the peasant class. They're still a feudal country. To peasants, she suppressed the crap out of them, right? And for them to like fight against a larger power and to acknowledge, like, that's cool if another country does it, but she would not want that to happen to her own country because the peasants, they hated the monarchy. They were very oppressive at this time.
She followed news of the war closely throughout its duration.
More about politics.
The British actually made multiple requests to hire Russian troops for the war in America. At one point, they even offered Russia the island of Minorca in the Mediterranean if they pledged to join the war on the British side against the French, or at least pressure them out of the war.
To be honest, actually it wouldn't be a bad thing for Russia. I mean, it's far away, but hey, warm water access to any kind of ports. Catherine was the one, if you can see on the map here, I don't know if you can see my mouse very well, look at Russia. Going down to Crimea, this is the time when the Russians did this. So Peter had conquered some of the territory up by the Baltic, which is okay because before this, Russia didn't have any warm water ports. And to be like a European nation, it was all about having naval power. But like St. Petersburg can freeze over in the wintertime. So the Russians, you know, they were trying to defeat Sweden to try to get that territory. Then they invaded into Poland eventually. And then down here, fighting the Ottomans for the Black Sea. That was the crown jewel there to get Crimea. You know, warm water ports all year round. Very important to Russia, as you can see today. Russia's very invested in Crimea. So, yep.
Catherine, of course, declined these offers. Overall, Russia's main influence in the American War of Independence came from organizing the First League of Armed Neutrality in 1780. During the war, the British frequently stopped and searched the ships of neutral nations for French contraband. At times, the British even seized the ships permanently or kidnapped their sailors and forced them to serve in the British Navy, called impressment. British interference with their trade outraged the Russians. Thus, Russia led the way in establishing this league, which many neutral nations would end up joining to attempt to force an end to these practices and assert the right of neutral nations to trade with whomever they wished.
Right.
But while there may have been quiet approval among the Russian elite of the colony's separation from Britain, it is important to note that, Overall, the Russians strongly avoided taking a side in the conflict and did not directly support the Americans in any way.
That's why, like, it's a minor thing. Like, it's so much more minor, even I think, than he brings it up about what was actually going on there. You know, I think these countries, though, understand, though, that, you know, the newly independent and created United States, like, it's going to be a power. It's going to be important going forward. So establishing relationships, I think you could easily tell if you're one of these monarchs, is going to be important.
They even rejected American efforts at diplomacy until peace came with Britain to avoid irritating the British too much.
Yeah, you don't want to deal with
Every
that.
choice Catherine made, regardless of which side it benefited, was done for Russia's sake. It is also worth noting that American ideals themselves were not well received in Russia. Works like the Declaration of Independence, for example, were partially, if not fully, censored there in many circumstances, as they were deemed
Don't
too
want the
radical.
people reading about
This also
that.
occurred in other nations, such as our next country, Austria.
So look at, dude, Austria's whack. Look at it. Freaking Habsburgs. Just like, let's just make little states all over the place, dude. The Habsburgs were whack. Anyway, so yeah, you can see what's going on there as far as there's so much more political stuff. But the irony of all of it, it's like, we like the Americans did this for whatever reason, but like, we don't want those ideas to get out to the rest of like the common people of Europe there. Same thing happened with something like France, you know, during the French Revolution. One of the reasons that other countries fought against the revolutionaries and sided with the monarchs of France, not because they liked the monarchs, right? There was great rivalries there, but they don't want the revolution to spread into their country. They don't want the regular people to be like, yeah, we gotta, you know, you look at the Declaration of Rights of Man and like, we don't want the people to do that and have to claim all these rights, right? We're going to protect this sacred institution of monarchy.
Austria, one of two major German powers and a member of the League of Armed Neutrality, was neutral, having little cause to support either side. As is discussed in Jonathan Singerton's 2022 book, The American Revolution and the Habsburg Monarchy, American diplomats, called militia diplomats, arrived at various
Habsburgs are so
courts in
gross,
Europe
dude.
during the war uninvited, seeking to open up relations with various powers that could benefit America. In the Austrian capital of Vienna, William Lee arrived,
Vienna is cool,
seeking
though.
to
Yeah, it's
establish relations, trade, and possibly even an alliance, hoping the Austrians could stop German troops from being recruited by the British and antagonize Hanover, ruled by the British king. The British, however, were also actively pushing to draw the Austrians onto their side, mainly against France rather than America itself. However, the Austrians still maintained a tenuous alliance with the French. Maria Theresa never officially granted American representatives an audience. Lee tagged along with a French diplomat to speak to Austrian officials, but
Austria
they
didn't care.
bluntly ignored him. In one incident, they arrived to speak with the Austrian Imperial Vice-Chancellor to find him in a meeting with the British. Unsurprisingly, there was apparently a lot of yelling. As Singerton noted, the Austrians were concerned about the potential effects of legitimizing a revolution against a legitimate monarch, lest they encourage the same thing in their own domains.
Yep.
Furthermore, Maria Theresa voiced concerns that the war could evolve into a much larger war, very much like the 7 Years' War, by European nations invoking their alliances.
That's fair.
The potential trigger for such a war came with the War of Bavarian Succession between Austria and Prussia in 1778. This could have merged with the American War of Independence when the Austrians asked for French aid, but
It's all within the context of like, this is the beginning of the end for like the Habsburgs. And yeah, they're going to control Austria to World War I, but like, it's breaking apart. Like, it's totally breaking apart, right? You know, they're not into the Enlightenment stuff. They're still more into like figuring out how to keep bloodline in the family with incestuous relationships.
France was not interested in becoming involved militarily. French refusal to aid them against Prussia ensured that Austria would not aid the French against Britain.
Dude, just look at the map of Europe at this time. Obviously, it's nothing like what we see today, and this is going to be redrawn after the Napoleonic Wars. But like, how can you have? You can't have a stability in Europe with this. This is an absolute just mess. Somebody vomited on the map and it's like, all right, here's the map of Europe. Right? Europe's got so many problems here. It's why the American Revolution, unless you're a high-ranking official with conspiracies or something on the mind. It's like it's
against Prussia ensured that Austria would not aid the French against Britain. Therefore, while the Austrians kept a close eye on the conflict, they remained adamantly neutral, as there was no benefit to any other course.
Yeah.
It is worth noting that, like in many countries, a majority of the Austrian nobility seemed to favor American independence, and were fascinated by it, as Singerton also describes. Prussia...
See, you might think, don't mistake nobility with like the monarchy or the royal family. Remember, nobility and monarchies for centuries have been at each other because nobles, like noble families, always have felt like they should have more power, right? And to be honest, the monarchs here in this time of absolute monarchy only have power because they have basically a deal struck up with noble families. Noble families can be a big threat to to monarchs. Remember, they control land, they control food, they can raise armies, they can do all that stuff, and they're always a big threat. So you could see why it wouldn't be super surprising for that aristocrats are going to be powerful. Because let's be honest, in the United States, aristocrats, people with significant land ownership, during the era, the colonial era, are going to be the ones that are still going to be the power in the United States once it became formed. As you know, aristocrats in America and business owners are still going to run things because they're the ones, because they own property, are going to be able to vote while other people couldn't. There's still an aristocratic tie there.
The other main German power on the continent, and a member of the League of Armed Neutrality, also maintained neutrality throughout the conflict. However, as historian Paul Leland Haworth put it, quote, King Frederick entertained an intense hatred for England, and was consequently glad to see her humiliated, end quote. This hatred mainly stemmed from the 7 Years' War the decade prior, in which Frederick felt the British had abandoned Prussia. The king's preference for an American victory is clear in his private correspondence with his own ministers. However, this was purely because it would have slightly benefited Prussia. Overall, Frederick found no compelling reason to actively challenge Britain and support the Americans, opting mainly to be only a tranquil spectator, as he called himself.
You noticing the trend here for all of them? It's like no one thought anyone was worth it.
He became especially reluctant to poke Britain when Prussia went to war with Austria in 1778. He therefore waited before opening up anything like formal diplomacy or trade with the Americans until the war was over. Still, he and his officials maintained arm's-length correspondence with American diplomats. In one incident, the king briefly let slip information with the Americans about the possibility of Britain recruiting troops from surrounding nations. Perhaps most importantly, Haworth argued that had Prussia shown signs of taking the side of Britain against France were they to support the Americans, France may have been reluctant to do so to avoid a larger war on the continent. Frederick quietly suggesting the opposite, therefore, might have influenced the entire course of the war. Fascinatingly, after the war, there was quiet talk among Americans who were sympathetic to the idea of establishing an American monarchy of selecting a member of Prussia's royal family to reign over the United States as king, which we actually also made a video about. The link to that video.
It's like, did you guys even read like any of the literature like coming out about the revolution and like why they're doing it? They're literally trying to free themselves from monarchy. Yeah, there are people that thought, okay, maybe you can make an American monarchy or something. But like, no, like, it's like, did you even read it? Did you read the notes before? Did you even read the preface? Did you read the abstract before you read the paper of what the revolution was about?
Video will be in the description. The British were able to count on support from various other German states. They employed auxiliary forces from several of them, most famously from Hesse Castle, but others as well. It was, in fact, a common practice for some of the smaller German states of the Holy Roman Empire to raise armies for the purpose of loaning them to larger nations in exchange for compensation.
And then Washington killed them in their sleep on Christmas.
The British often took advantage of this offer. These Germans had no personal motivation to join the war. They were simply hired by the British to do so. Regarding the Netherlands, from the outset of
being a hired mercenary is just wild to me. Like risking your life in conflicts for some money? Like that's so wild to me to do that. Like, do you just come from total desperation, or are you just like a violent freak? You know what I mean?
The conflict.
All right, the Dutch,
By the
right?
British to do so. Regarding the Netherlands, from the outset of the conflict, Dutch merchants had been selling arms and munitions to the rebel forces and serving as middlemen for the secret French supplies. Still, the Dutch had previously
Great
held an
traders.
alliance with Britain.
I
and
love
the
Russian boats, the flutes. Or did I say Russian? Sorry, I meant Dutch. Sorry, yeah. They had of the whole like this whole era. I like the Dutch ships the best. I think they're just so cool. You know, actually, they're getting okay. Some of the ones in the 1800s are getting better from like the British and stuff, but like it kind of the first half of Age of Exploration, so like 1500s to especially to the 1600s, and then into the 1700s. I love the Dutch ships.
French supplies. Still, the Dutch had previously held an alliance with Britain, and the British felt that they would ultimately take their side in the conflict. However, opinion among the Dutch was quite divided. Though the stadtholder, or leader, of the Netherlands was pro-British, many of the Dutch elite did not share his position, such as Johan Dirk, Baron van der Capellen Totenpol, who was highly supportive of the Americans.
Dutch names.
It was also not lost on many Dutchmen that their former allies had usurped much of their dominance in commerce. In 1778,
This has already been the end of really the Dutch, I guess you can call it empire. So really the kind of the ladder, if you want to look at it, for overseas power from Europeans, it goes the Portuguese, and mostly in Asia too, but like the the Portuguese, and then the Dutch come in, and then the French and English kind of surpass that. The Spanish, as you know, focus more on the Western Hemisphere. So that's a different line of succession, going back to line of demarcation back in the late 1400s.
Compelled the Dutch to join the war on their side, but the Dutch refused. That same year, the French joined the war. The British became especially concerned about Dutch trade with the French. To weaken France, the Dutch became a major target of Britain's efforts to seize and sometimes even take ships carrying supplies intended for their enemies. Tensions worsened. In 1779, the Dutch allowed the famous American captain who attacked the British in their own waters, John Paul Jones, to take refuge in the port of Texel. Their hesitancy in allowing the British to enter and seize him allowed him to escape, which infuriated Britain. In 1780, the British gained greater insight into the Netherlands' secret assistance to the Americans. The seizure of Dutch ships increased. This prompted the Dutch to join the League of Armed Neutrality, a move by which Britain felt threatened. They declared war on the Dutch that year, making it...
I don't care where you are and what infrastructure you have. The Dutch just always look like they're drowning. The Netherlands just looks like it's drowning. Like you see all these pictures, and they're obviously amazing at infrastructure and controlling water flows, but your country's built below sea level. It's like, even if you're good at controlling, it just seems wild, doesn't it? Look at it.
A move by which Britain felt threatened.
They declared
war on the Dutch that year, making it impossible for them to join a league of neutral nations, thus marking the beginning of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. The Dutch did not enter into a direct alliance with the French or Americans, but became more amiable to both and worked especially alongside the French.
They're in it for money. Money. The Dutch are a trading nation. It's what they do.
In 1782, American ambassador and future president John Adams secured the recognition of the United States from the Dutch. While nations
he spoke
like
Dutch, right? Wasn't he one of the ones? Adams spoke a bunch of languages, right?
And the Netherlands recognized the independence of the United States early on. The first foreign nation to recognize American independence was the Kingdom of Morocco in 1777. This may be surprising given that Morocco had no obvious reason to involve themselves in a distant British colonial rebellion. However, the American Revolution occurred during a period in which the Moroccan Sultan Sidi Mohammed bin Abdullah was aggressively expanding trade with foreign nations. The Sultan had opened his ports to a great many nations with whom the Moroccans did not have official trade agreements. Among those they listed was the United States, with whom he attempted to establish an official treaty soon after. The United States, preoccupied with war, was slow to react. Once the war was over, the Sultan made it very clear he was determined to establish this trade agreement.
I just started learning a little bit more about the Barbary Wars, which are going to take place after American Revolution, but like fascinating time period, and got kind of some of the first conflicts where the U.S. Navy kind of was getting their newly created navy was getting their feet wet. I did some commentary on a video, the Barbary Wars one. Who made that one? I forgot where it was. If you're looking into that, want to hear kind of what I have to say and my reaction to. Oh, it was the Fat Electrician. Fat Electrician did a good one on the Barbary Wars. That was really funny. So check that out if you want to know more about the Americans dealing with kind of North Africa, the Ottoman Empire.
In 1784, the Moroccans captured the American ship Betsy and its crew, promising to return the ship and release the prisoners only once a trade agreement had been struck, which one was in 1786. Across the sea and closer to the conflict, the responses of the various Native American tribes affected by the conflict were as varied as the Europeans. Most remained neutral, but a number of tribes fought in the war on each side. In some instances, different factions within the same tribes aligned with different sides. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, was divided over the issue. Most Iroquois nations sided with the British, while the Oneida and Tuscarora sided with the Americans.
So a big reason for that was the Native Americans were already living in a time period where their lands were, routinely being taken over, and so for them, their goal was try to side with who is going to give them the best life, essentially. So like the British, notorious for, they'd go in and say that, help us and we will make sure your lands get protected. They did the same thing to slaves. Say like, hey, if slaves come up and we'll guarantee you freedom. You know what I mean? So it was a lot of incentive for Native Americans or slaves in America to actually side with the British, and it would be worse off for them if the Americans won. And to be honest, in both cases, of what ended up happening, whether you're a slave or Native American, it ended up being worse for you by supporting the Americans. Because those things aren't going to end.
Civil War ended a long-standing peace between the nations of the Confederacy. Another group, which were notably divided in the war, were the Cherokee. One of the grievances that the colonists had with Britain was that in 1763, the Crown forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and ordered the colonists settled there to return east in order to end conflict with the indigenous tribes.
And farmers were like, no, we want to go west. Settlers are like, we want to go west. We want to go west. By the way, they did it anyways. Yes, there was that line and those laws established, but Americans were still doing it anyways.
As is discussed by the Museum of the American Revolution, native groups which feared that an independent America would alter or ignore this arrangement decided to align themselves with the British. Indeed, most tribes who joined were convinced by this argument, and thus the British had better luck in acquiring their assistance.
Yep.
Other native groups resented the British, however. And
it was also really important for the British to use them for strategic purposes. The British did not have good geographic understanding of the wilderness in North America. So using them and using their trails and understanding and using their geographic knowledge was very important.
That an independent United States might be more willing to work with them, partly because of the friendships they had established with their immediate colonial neighbors. On the contrary, when the war was over, the Americans did indeed press westward into native lands, even those of their allies. Most other nations,
look, we're also going to get Trail of Tears in the coming decades.
Who paid attention to the conflict, including Sweden, Denmark, and the Ottoman Empire, remained neutral during the war and only opened up trade and relations with the Americans when they established peace with Britain. Their responses were similar to those which we have already discussed, with the Scandinavians being key players in the League of Armed Neutrality. The same is true of the various Italian states, though Singerton notes that Tuscany's Grand Duke at the time, the future Leopold II of Austria, was especially fascinated by the revolution's principles, enough to consider the implementation of similar ideas in his own lands. In summary, most of Europe's leaders regarded the notion of an uprising against what they deemed a legitimate monarch with concern, to the point of some countries censoring the radical ideas proclaimed by the American Revolution.
It's like, you're having a revolution. People are asking the monarch, hey, we heard America's having a revolution. That's true, right? And they're like, yeah, it was. Oh, what was it about? Shut up.
More, many feared
back to
the
work.
potential for the conflict to spiral into a much larger one. However, in an age in which all the powers of Europe were in some form of competition with each other, it was an opportunity to check the power of the one which had recently been seeing the most success, and so most European leaders were at least quietly supportive of America's endeavors. Still, only those more directly threatened by British power became involved in the conflict. Yeah. Regarding the revolution's ideals,
biggest enemies.
while Europe's governments were quite disturbed by them, not all Europeans were opposed to them.
They're like, the Americans are barbaric. That's what some of them would say. But again, some of them are like, but we want power too.
People across Europe who were influenced by Enlightenment thinking were fascinated by the revolution and quite supportive of a new country seeking to experiment with and embody these ideas.
Yeah. Enlightenment thinkers loved it. All those guys. If you were around and weren't dead yet, like so many of the Enlightenment thinkers that influenced the revolution, but they were like, yes, Thomas Paine or something. Like they loved it. They loved the idea of it. And then, it's going to, have some grassroots discussions and stuff with some of these people. Again, you see it with the French Revolution immediately after. So it wasn't lost on some people, but remember these Enlightenment dudes, they're not peasant folk. They're people within powerful families. They're literate and they can go to these salons and be all fancy and talk about revolutionary ideas.
Overall, a majority of continental Europe's upper classes seemed to sympathize with the American cause. In time, however, this sense of approval would flip during the chaos of the French Revolution, the challenging of traditional authority.
What I mean by upper middle class is not the royal families, but the right below. So it really, I guess you wouldn't say upper middle class. That'd be more like rich business owners. These are all aristocrats that we're talking about here.
He was deemed dangerous and radical, and thus the American Revolution came to be viewed in a different light for some time, with its ideas repressed further. As for the Native Americans, they were in direct competition with the colonists, and thus when they did become involved, it was largely on the British side, in the hopes that Britain would be less invasive. Though this was not a universal stance, with some taking the American side.
Good job in this video, by the way.
Beyond these regions, the revolution was mostly too distant of an event for people to have had a strong reaction. Finally, it is important to note that the American Revolution across the world is a huge and varied topic. This video was meant solely to summarize the primary responses of various different nations whose reactions are less well known.
So, okay. All right, actually wrapping up.
I hope you enjoyed this video.
Final thoughts. I got a few other important points. Don't go anywhere. So what I wanted to say is that another perspective to look at here, and because this is titled Major Nations, but what about other groups, other people? So the other groups that would be very much inspired by this would be other colonies of other places. The American Revolution for that was very influential because the Americans were kind of one of the first here of these important colonies to fight and get their independence, and that was inspirational. And the Declaration of Independence, like for example, and the American Constitution that's eventually going to come with it are going to be far more influential than the revolution itself, because this is the birth of the era of revolutions. There's going to be political revolutions start from here all the way through. Well, it depends on when you want to stop. A lot of them are going to be here in the 1800s. And then of course, some, it's going to be later, like into the modern era around the world wars. But that was very inspirational that way. So it was more inspirational, not to major nations, but to colonies around the world. Okay. And yeah, you're going to see that. Now, the last thing I just wanted to mention was, as compared to like the French Revolution was far more concerning for major countries in Europe than the American Revolution was. That was truly seen like a direct threat to the status quo of Europe, again with the French Revolution, than the American Revolution. Anyways, Fire of Learning, great job there. A lot of great info. Hopefully you're able to learn a lot from it. Hopefully I was able to add some stuff for you, get some conversation going, and get you thinking about some other topics. So with that, thanks for hanging out with me, and we'll see you all next time. Bye.